This is Support is Sexy, episode 291, with Cyndie Spiegel, founder of the Collective of Us. Welcome to Support is Sexy. I'm your host, Elayne Fluker, entrepreneur, author, and founder of Chic Rebellion Media. 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, I interview inspiring women entrepreneurs who share their wins and their lessons to help you take your business and your life to the next level and create something sexy. Here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Support is Sexy. I'm excited to have you here. It just would not be the same without you. And if you want to connect with a passionate community of women entrepreneurs around the world who support you and who want to see you win, go to supportissexymastermind.com now to become a member. Now, on today's episode, we are welcoming Cyndie Spiegel, and Cyndie is the founder of the Collective of Us. I love that name. And she's also a small business coach. And what I love about the discussion that I had with Cyndie was something that I learned or really discovered that I need to push myself more with is the importance of the ask. Actually, not just the ask, the big ask, right? I always talk about support is sexy, getting support, asking for it, and accepting it. Well, also supporting yourself by making an ask that doesn't play you small, making the big ask. So we talk about that in this episode, how she supports other women entrepreneurs in doing that and so much more. So what else you'll learn from Cyndie is how to move on from that dream job when it's no longer your dream, the importance of taking the space to figure out what's next, why you have to have an honest conversation with yourself about what you're willing to give up and what you refuse to give up for your dream, how the lowest moments in your journey can be the catalyst for great change in your life, remembering that you're an expert of your own experiences, something that I shared with her and we discussed at length and I've shared with all of you before. You're an expert of your own experiences. Also, how to get over the curse of knowledge, the value of trusting your intuition, how self-worth and rejection ties into our pricing when we're talking about pricing our services and our products. Very important, so make sure to listen out for that. How to find people who will pay for your prices, and also fail fast and keep it moving. So I know you're going to enjoy this episode with Cyndie. So without further ado, Cyndie Spiegel. So Cyndie, thank you so much for joining us for an episode of Support is Sexy. I'm excited to chat with you.
Oh, so excited to be here. So excited.
Excellent. So our first question, when did you first fall in love with entrepreneurship?
It's interesting. I didn't know that I was in love with entrepreneurship until I would say the last 2 years or so. But I grew up with my aunt who owned a business, a record store at the time. My mom, when I was very young, owned a business. It was an arcade because in the 80s, that's what folks did. They played videos in an arcade and not at home. So I had sort of disconnected from entrepreneurship for a long time until I restarted my own business about 4 years ago. And I would say in the last 3 to 4 years, really reconnected with the idea of entrepreneurship and fell in love with it. Not only my own being of an entrepreneur, but also supporting other entrepreneurs. So I'd like to say the seed was planted as a kid and it came back as an adult.
And where did you grow up? You mentioned growing up and people going to the arcade.
Yeah, I grew up in New Jersey. So interestingly enough, I grew up fairly poor in New Jersey, but there was this sort of bubble of time in my childhood where my mom opened a video arcade. It was called the Beehive, and it was in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And it was it was sort of a very magical period of time in my life. And I guess I was probably between the ages of maybe 5 and 8 years old. And it was just this magical time where all of my older brothers, their friends would come into the video arcade and everybody would hang out. And my mom would sort of give the local kids ice cream scoops for every A that they got. So my mom was very much sort of the neighborhood mom, and made sure that kids stayed on track because, it wasn't a great neighborhood that we grew up in, but the arcade was sort of the epicenter of that. Mm-hmm. And it was where all of the kids came through all the time. So my mom sort of was looking out. She was everybody's mama. I don't know where all that story was coming from or going to, but reminded me of the arcade, and so there we go.
Now, with the with opening the business for your mom, and you mentioned that you grew up poor, how did she go about doing that? Were you able to observe that?
I did, yeah. And as I said before, it kind of went away for a long time. I forgot about it because she only had it for a couple of years. But we lived on the second floor of an apartment building, and there was a retail space underneath. And I don't know exactly how the arcade came about, but it did, and it was thriving for a couple of years. And one of the things, as I look back, that I realized about that period of time in my life was that I really understood the power that came from owning a business. Sort of what that was like when you own it and what that takes away from you when you don't own it anymore. Having seen my mom own a business and not own a business, having seen my aunt own a business and not own a business, there's a certain sense of value that was ripped away, or it felt like a sense of value that was ripped away. And I'm pretty certain that's actually part of how I got to where I am today in terms of supporting women, because I see the power in being able to take care of yourself. And I learned at a very, very young age that when you don't have that capacity or that ability, it takes away a certain sense of self-worth. And I watched that with my mom and I watched that with my aunt. And it's really become a mission of mine to make sure that women can really attain that, and can attain it fairly easily and be able to build sustainable businesses because of that time from when we had the arcade.
Now, what would you say, or who would you say were some of your greatest influences growing up?
Oh, interestingly enough, my mom, but not for the traditional reasons, more so because my mom was able to, she didn't, we had a rough childhood. I had a rougher childhood. Like I said before, we grew up in poverty. But what was interesting is at the age of 50, my mom got her driver's license. At the age of 65, she got her bachelor's degree. So she had done all of these interesting things at much later periods of time than most other people did. And I remember it was kind of at a pivotal time in my own life. I guess I was probably just starting college as she was doing these things. And I remember thinking it's never too late. So for that reason, I would say my mom has been one of my greatest influences. And also, this is going to sound very, very cliche, but Oprah. Oprah.
Nothing cliche about Oprah.
I know. She's the Oprah. But really, some of my greatest influences were my mom and Oprah Winfrey, believe it or not.
Now, it was you, your mom, and how many brothers did you say you have?
I have 3 older brothers.
Okay, you're the baby.
No sisters. I am the baby, and I am the only girl. And my dad passed away over a decade ago, so I actually got married 6 weeks ago, and my oldest brother walked me down the aisle.
You got married 6 weeks ago?
I did.
Congratulations.
Thank
that's
you.
great.
No, it was pretty spectacular. It was very special. We got married in Minnesota, and my oldest brother walked me down the aisle, and said a little prayer for my papa before we walked down the aisle, but it was pretty special.
Oh, that's amazing. I love it. Beautiful. Now, what did you think that you were going to be sort of when you got older, as you were growing up in Jersey and seeing your mom have the business and then not have the business, and just what kind of ideas did you have about what you were interested in or what you wanted to do?
For 15 years, Elayne, I actually worked in fashion, and I knew from the age of 13 that I was never going to be a poor adult. I think when you grow up in poverty, you have set mindsets about how you'll be as an adult, and it can go either way. For me, I knew that I was never going to be a poor adult, and I was going to have a traditional career, which I hadn't really seen in my household growing up. So I went to college. I knew that the key would be education. So I went off to college. I went to school for fashion. I started working in fashion when I was 17 at the local Gap Kids, and eventually progressed my career to the director of product at Narciso Rodriguez, which was about 5 years ago. But I always knew that I was going to work in fashion, and it was going to be a traditional career.
Right. What was it about? Well, first, I wanted to ask you a question about growing up in poverty. Do you feel like you were very aware that you all were growing up in poverty? Because I ask that because some people have talked about that experience and how they weren't aware, or they weren't aware until a certain point. Usually it's because other kids say something horrible to them, which I hope wasn't your experience, or there's just some sort of moment where they all of a sudden become aware that other kids aren't living the same way. So I'm just curious with you. And then also that point where you decided, as you said, I know I'm going to have a traditional job because I've seen how not having one affects people and that kind of thing.
I always knew that I was poor. We always knew that we were poor. I'm pretty sure of it. But interestingly enough, I think when you grow up in an area where most other folks are in the same financial situation as you are, it doesn't really define you. necessarily. And truthfully, we had a lot more than other folks. And I think at a very young age, we were taught to value things other than money. Mm-hmm. You know, and so it didn't, as a kid, I remember thinking I'm not going to be a poor adult, but I never really felt as though I didn't fit in the community I grew up in because I was poor, because we lived in a pretty low socioeconomic area.
Mm-hmm. So what was it then about fashion that drew you to fashion of all things?
Working at the Gap, believe it or not. I mean, it took a long time as an adult to realize that I just wasn't passionate about fashion. I was passionate about strategy. But I think as I was growing up, the only entry into the world of fashion that I had was working at the Gap. So something as simple as folding t-shirts at the Gap sort of created this real interest in style. Mm-hmm. And style, you know, sort of escalated into fashion and then going to FIT. And I didn't know as a kid that it would be in fashion. It's just what, you know, it just was sort of the path that I took. And I think it was partially because that was the work that I knew from being a teenager.
Now, what did the path look like from Gap Kids to Narciso? It's pretty big.
Yeah, it's a big
I know,
gap.
you have to give us all the details, but that's a beautiful jump there.
It is, and it was 15 years in the making.
Right.
I worked from the time I went to FIT for both my undergrad and also I have a global business, a master's degree from there as well. But mm-hmm. I worked in corporate fashion for a long time. I worked at Coach for, you know, prior to being at Narciso, the corporate offices there. Had traveled quite a bit and sort of grew my career in fashion. But it started when I was 19 years old and ended when I was 35 years old. I'll be 40 in November. So it was a long and winding road. And I think the more successful I became in fashion, the more of a realization I had that it wasn't actually what I was passionate about. You know, I loved the work I was doing. I didn't care if it was my business, somebody else's business, if it was fashion or if it was cars. Mm-hmm. It was the strategy that was important. It was the people that were important to me.
So tell us about the moment then that you came to, you mentioned it, I saw it on your website, where you decided, as you mentioned, that you moved out of fashion, that wasn't it for you anymore. And mm-hmm. then the period that you went through that was sort of a trial and error of you finding what that next thing was going to be or what really worked best for you.
Mm-hmm. So it was spring 2013, which I always like to say is 2012 in real life, Fashion Week in New York City. And it was the night before the spring show for Narciso. And it was 2:00 in the morning in Elayne. And I remember looking around and everybody was so happy to be there. Narciso was requesting another pair of pants be made for the show the next day. And mm-hmm. everybody was super involved. And I remember looking around going, this is not my life. This is not the life I set out for. Like how, and another thing I was acutely aware of was that so many people envied where I was at that moment. Mm-hmm. But I didn't appreciate it. And I knew that it wasn't going to get better because working for a beautiful brand that you love, traveling business class to Italy, like I had it as good as it was going to get.
And sometimes that makes it hard to, sorry to interrupt, but sometimes that makes it hard to let go, right? It's like, well, everyone else would love to have this job, or I quote unquote should be happy to have this.
Yeah. And I think that was part of it, right? That's why I left fashion at 35 and not 30. Mm-hmm, was right. Because of what everybody else, you know, but as we grow into ourselves, really, regardless of whatever age that is, we start to really tap into the part of us that we trust, which is internal, right? We stop caring as much about what everybody else wishes they had and how enviable our positions are. And instead we tap in, and I think that's where the work happens. And that's where the hard decisions come. And for me, that was that moment at Narciso at 2:00 in the morning where I said, I know it's not going to get better than this if I stay in fashion. Like this is about as good as it's going to get. And so I have to leave. That was my only option, was to leave. And so I did.
What were the first steps for you once you sort of came to that realization and making that transition? Did you do it right away, or did you do it over time and sort of feel your way through some other things to find out what was going to be next? What did it look like for you?
Oh, Elayne, I wish I did. No, I waited 1 week for, post, anybody in fashion will get this, but post the show, you just kind of have to let the world resettle.
Right.
So I waited exactly 1 week, and I went into Narciso's office and I said, I won't re-sign my contract. And I didn't have a plan. All I knew, I trusted that strange voice inside that said that you just have to leave here to figure out what's next. Like I essentially had to risk it all. to
and
figure
create
out what
space
was
to
next.
figure out, right?
Exactly. Because what I knew is that I would continue to get work. Work wasn't going to be an issue. And that was, again, an enviable position to be in. The work was saying no to money that was being offered to you, saying no to cool brands that would want to work together, but the work was in saying no and taking the space to really figure out what was next.
Did you have yourself in a position where you didn't have to worry about anything financially during that time so that you could say no to whatever else came along? And I ask that because a lot of people who might in some ways be in that position, but they may feel like, oh, I have to stay because of, for financial reasons, or they might throw everything up in the air and take the risk, but not be thinking about what will happen if I don't have money coming in. As you said, you were in a position where you were getting offers from other people. What do you advise, or what was your experience?
So again, I wish it was this thought out. I did have money in the bank. I had a 401k plan. I had some money accessible. I didn't really start to work again. I didn't really start to build what I now refer to as Cyndie Inc. for probably 8 or 9 months. And so I quickly worked through my savings because, again, a decision that I made for myself, and I think this sort of stemmed from growing up in poverty, is I remember saying, I know I have to give up something, but I'm not willing to give up my lifestyle to figure out next steps. And what that, in fact, did was I went $20,000 into debt to figure out my next steps. Maybe a little bit more than that, actually. But I remember it being a very conscious decision. I remember saying to myself, you will make this money back, but I'm not willing to give up my apartment. I'm not willing to give up the foundational things that I need to figure out this transition. Like my stability, I wasn't willing to give that up. And so did I have the money? I had some money, not enough to cover me through 8 or 9 months of, my lifestyle. Right. Absolutely not. But I figured it out and I took the risk, but and I just believed in what was possible. And for sure I did the right thing.
Excellent. And it sounds two things. One, I think what you just mentioned is so powerful and important, knowing what you're willing to give up and what you're not willing to give up. I think that'll help people make, in making that decision, it gives you sort of some guardrails, if you will. Yeah. I know there were things for me, certain things I just did not want to give up, going to have to figure that out, and other things, okay, how far? And I think, let me know what you think. For me, in going through that, of looking at what I was willing to give up, sort of gave me a sense of how badly I wanted that. And I'm talking about, for me, in reference to starting an online business and, things being a little different and figuring things out. It's sort of like, I'm willing to give up this, or I'm willing to give up that. And I thought, wow, I must really want this. Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yeah. That'll teach you quickly what you're willing, what you'll take and what you won't in order to have that thing that you're seeking. And I remember thinking to myself, I'll give up $13 cocktails, but I will not give up my fancy Brooklyn apartment.
Right. Exactly.
Again, it's give and take, right? You have to decide for yourself, or anyone listening, you really have to decide for yourself what it is that you're willing to give up, and be honest with yourself, because that's going to really set you up for the direction in which you can go today.
Now, during that 8 or 9 months, what was a goal or intention for you? Did you have an idea of the direction you wanted to go, or was it really trial and error of different things? I know you mentioned sort of some international consulting things that you did, and that kind of, tell us about that period.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, the international consulting was all building up to what I refer to as Cyndie Inc. So that was prior to me leaving fashion. I really took that 8 months to just do nothing and to really kind of see what was happening around me. I mean, up until that point, I was working a corporate job. I didn't know anything about the online world. I didn't even have an Instagram account. This was not, when you work a 9 to 5, there are things that happen in the greater world that you just don't really have to be aware of. And not that Instagram was one of those things. That's just me making excuses for myself for not being on social media. But
it's okay.
But, there were so many things that I didn't know. And in taking that time, I remember I was dating an entrepreneur at the time, a fairly successful entrepreneur, and just sort of soaking in what that was like to work for yourself, because that didn't occur to me when I left fashion, that I would work for myself. I just knew that I couldn't do what I was doing, if that makes sense. And so I think partially, me being around him a lot really taught me about this world of entrepreneurship that I had sort of lost from childhood. I had just not tapped into. I didn't remember. Most of my friends worked in fashion or in the wellness space. So that first 8 months, it was really hard. I had worked since the time I was 16 or so. As soon as I could start working, I started making my own money. So to be 35 and not making money was incredibly introspective, but really hard. And I'll often tell the story about how I knew things were going to shift for me when I found myself on my kitchen floor. It was by the garbage can. This is it's a terrible story, but it is true. I remember it was 3:00 in the morning. I was having terrible anxiety during those 8 months. I couldn't sleep. I wasn't eating properly. I was losing a ton of weight. And I found myself on the kitchen floor at 3 a.m. saying, you should be in the garbage. How could you have imploded everything that you had? You know, you don't even deserve to be here. You don't deserve any of this. You came from where you came from. You got to where you got. And this is how you end up. And it was a terrible moment. Like, it was an awful moment for me. But I remember waking up the next day with so much more clarity. And that clarity was like, get it together. Like, get it together. You don't come this far to find yourself in that position and not do anything. Like, get it together. And so that's what I did. You know, I slowly started, really understanding what it is that I was good at. And I think part of that was doing all the self-work that I'd done over that 8 months, and thinking I should be just talking about what I'm passionate about and allowing myself to talk about it, not needing to have quote unquote expertise to be myself. Right? Sometimes we prevent ourselves from saying things or from doing things because we don't think that we hold the value to say them. And I remember I started going out on social media, and on Instagram. And sometimes I look back at really old posts to sort of see the real refinement of what my message was and what my voice was. But I remember early on giving myself permission to do that. Teaching, I started teaching at Parsons, mentoring women who were starting businesses. And just slowly I got out of that slump and started doing the thing that I innately felt called upon to do, but I didn't necessarily know how I was going to craft it into a business. So I just started doing it. And then I started charging for it. And, eventually I ended up where I am right now.
Wow. So first of all, thank you so much for sharing that part of your story about being on the floor next to the garbage can and feeling like, a really tough time. I wanted to ask you, what advice do you have for getting through nights like that for anyone who might be in that position where they feel like they either blow up their lives or, they risked it all and not sure it's going to work out even? Just sort of those, I've talked to people before where we talk about when people say when one door closes, another door opens or a window opens, but it's sort of like, what about that period where you're stuck in the hallway? Between the door, which a lot of us don't talk about, between the door and the other door or the door and the window. Yeah. It's pretty dirty. Yeah, exactly.
There's a garbage can there.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly. Or it's like, I'm walking on glass. How do I get through that? So for you, I know the next morning you woke up and, made that decision to move forward. But what was it like getting through that night?
Well, the night was crappy. But what I will say, and I remind myself of this often, this too shall pass. Mm-hmm. Right? Like everything that we experience in life, the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, this too shall pass. Right? We won't be in any particular space forever because life is too transformational. It's too evolutionary. So this moment, whatever it is, no matter how hard it is, it will pass and we will come out of it. But we have to support ourselves in coming out of it.
That's right. And keep going. I always say, keep going. I try to tell myself, because I've had those moments too, for sure. Trash can or laid out on the floor, fetal position, whatever it is. And
that's a good one too.
That's a good one. Exactly. It happens. And it's just sort of like, okay, what am I supposed to be learning in this? Once I get through feeling, horrible or feeling sad for myself or whatever it is, there has to be some lesson in this, big or small. What am I supposed to be learning in this? Yeah. Excellent. So then tell us, another thing I wanted to mention for what you said, which I think is so powerful too, about, I just did an episode about this, being held up by the idea of waiting to become an expert in something. And I have a friend who says something I always repeat. He said, you are an expert of your own experiences.
Oof, ain't that the truth?
I know.
Isn't
it's like,
that so true?
Is good. Yes. So you are so right of doing it, learning as you go, but you have so much experience just from living and life and, work. So very good for you.
I always like to say to folks, which is kind of in line with what your friend shared with you, teach what you know.
Right.
Teach what you know and not what you don't. I have never gotten in front of an audience and said, I know everything about this topic. And I don't know even experts who do that, right? Quote unquote experts. I suppose I am one now, but just teach what you know. Don't promise anyone that you're going to teach them what you don't know. And if you can hold yourself to that standard that you will only teach what you know, you'll be fine. And it takes the pressure off. Just teach what you know.
Exactly. It takes the pressure off. And also for people listening to know, think about the things that you know that other people might not, because I think, what do they call it? The curse of knowledge. We think, oh, everybody knows how to do that, or that's easy. I know I went through that phase with helping people with their brand stories or writing their stories or media coaching. And I think, oh, well, that's nothing anybody really wants to learn, or that's not, until people kept asking me about it. And I said, maybe this is something I could package and offer to people. You know, sometimes when we're looking at how to start our own businesses, or that period, as you mentioned, of finding whatever it is, it's sort of think about the things that you know how to do that someone else might not, or that people ask you for all the time.
And that, exactly what you just said, Elayne, is kind of where I was right after that 8-month period of time. I remember texting my friends, and I still use this exercise in a workshop that I do for other folks, where I say, ask other folks, like text 10 of your friends and ask them what it is that they think you're good at.
Right.
And then write that same list for yourself and see where there's overlap. You know, because it really what I realized when I did that was like, oh my God, I am really good at empowering others to do things, like better at empowering others more so than I am at empowering myself half the time. But I remember by comparing those, it really sort of enlightened me as to where I should be, the space that I should be taking up in the world.
Right.
And other folks know, other folks know, they see us a lot more clearly than we see ourselves. So ask.
And they see the things, I think, to your point, I think they see the things that we do naturally. So that's why we're usually not aware of them. Not even just, your career or professional, those things, you've studied, you've learned. But if your friends say to you, for example, well, you're a natural leader and you help so-and-so do this and you help me do that. Yeah. You start thinking, oh, yeah, I did do that.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
So tap
into your circle.
Tap into your circle. That support is sexy. Absolutely.
Exactly.
So tell us now about the collective of us.
So the collective of us, I will often say that the collective of us is my life's work. But it is a community of women. It's an incubator for women small business owners. And I remember part of the initial reason the collective was started on a fluke. I was at a conference in Utah, and this is going to sound terrible for anyone listening, but I was at a conference in Utah, and there was a lovely woman who I met who looked at me and she said to me, "You are stunning for a Black woman." Oh. Yeah, exactly what you just did was what my mouth did. But here's the thing, Elayne, that I walked away understanding. She lived in a very, it was Utah. She was Mormon. She hadn't been exposed to very much outside of her own community. And I remember getting on a plane back to New York, thinking to myself, how can I connect women who think that that's appropriate with women in Brooklyn, New York, and women in, Florida, and women in Texas? Essentially, how can I bring all of these communities together so that women can empower and educate one another, and they can get out of their, essentially get out of your own black hole and have access to the rest of the world? Because not only did she not think that it was offensive, she thought she was paying me a compliment, which clearly not so much, but I understood her intention behind it. And that was that she had no clue what was happening in the rest of the world, but she happened to have a thriving business. And I remember at the time thinking, how in the hell did that just happen? How do you have a thriving business? And that's the kind of thing that comes out of your mouth. And I remember being on that plane back to New York thinking, how do I connect all these women? How do I connect all these dots so that these kinds of statements are not acceptable? And they don't know, they meaning anyone who is not around a lot of other folks or any kind of diversity, they don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And as a biracial woman, a biracial Jew at that, I was like, I have got to do my part to bring folks together and talk about businesses, because you can't say stuff like that. You just, in this day and age, you cannot say things like that. And so the collective wasn't started, to sort of, it wasn't started solely upon that, but it was the idea of how do I bring these women together and how do they learn from one another and how do we all empower and educate and enlighten one another? But
So
that to me was like the starting point. That was like, okay,
that was the
something's gotta be done
catalyst,
about
right?
this. I'd say so. Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that insane?
I know. Well, it's
Hindsight.
insane, but I totally have been there, or I've
Yes.
been from other, even women of color, that you're pretty for a dark skinned woman. That's
Oof.
I gotten that too.
Oh my
Not really. Thank you. Not sure where
I
that,
know. What
yeah.
do you say to that? Right? I mean, what does one? It is still surprising to me. It is still, and whenever I say that story, I can hear in your voice. You were just like,
Right.
oh,
Exactly. You just stop like, oh,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah. But it was the catalyst for something, so I'm grateful for that.
So, what do you feel like has been very important for you or helpful for you in bringing women together based on that story, and then the work that you've done with working with women entrepreneurs, especially, and bringing them together as a collective and letting them know? I mean, I know I've done this from my experience, and letting women know that it's not only okay to ask for support or come together and connect, but it's imperative for our success and survival.
That's right. I think, one of the key learnings from just building something like the collective is that we are unstoppable when we can empower one another. Like unstoppable. There's nothing we can't do. And I have seen this firsthand. Nothing we can't do when we learn how to empower one another, when we let go of the stigma of women being nice to one another, because there's this whole catty woman thing that we continue to, we continue sort of unknowingly to put that out into the world, that women are catty and women are this and women are that. And when you bring women together under the premise of building something, we will take over the world, and there is nothing like having a community to support you in doing that, but also a community of expertise. And when we can all build on what we are individually good at, that collectively we will all rise. And the quicker we learn that, the better off we'll be. And you can do that in any community. It doesn't have to be the collective of us, though it should be, but it doesn't have to be.
Right.
But the idea is that, support is sexy, and collectively we will all rise, but we do have to allow ourselves to support others.
What did you do? What were your first steps in bringing the right, not that any woman is wrong, but just the right mix of people or the right group of women together? What was it for you that helped you sort of form the collective? And how does it work for people to know who are listening?
Yeah. So first, I will say some women are wrong for the collective.
People have to be as invested as you are, right? In their success.
They have to be as invested. And also, again, there's every color, creed. Ultimately, you have to stand for women, right? You have to stand for women, and you have to be willing to share, to give as much as you get. And a lot of it, when I first launched the collective, I remember it was just an Instagram post. I just said, is anybody interested in this thing? And 36 people responded and said yes. And that started the beta of the collective of us almost 3 years ago. But ultimately, a lot of it was intuition, kind of trusting what I trusted, to go back to what we talked about before when you said you're an expert of your own experience, trusting what I trusted, having grown up the way I did and grown into an adult the way I did, trusted that these folks that I was interviewing at the time for the collective stood for what we stood for, trusted that they were the right people. And eventually I didn't have to interview women anymore. I put together an application, and I slowly was, I could read between the lines. And I have yet to say, honestly, I've not made a bad decision when it comes to accepting someone into the collective of us. And I think our intuition is more powerful than we often know. So the second we start to trust it, we start to make really smart decisions around it, using that as our basis point.
And what does the process or the period within the collective look like? Is it for a certain amount of time that people are in it, like a mastermind, or is it ongoing support?
So it is ongoing. The initial joining of the collective is 3 months, and it's strategy. We have an in-house counsel, so everyone in the collective will work on the basics of their business, right? A financial plan, working through fear. So I like to say it's as much wisdom as it is strategy. And it's about 3 months, the first 3 months, where you're working through all the basics of what you need to build a bold business, which is about the community. This is the support is sexy part of it, right? Building a community, building your own community, moving through fear. How do you know how much money to charge? What should happen from a legal standpoint of building your business out? We'll talk about things like, how do you want to forecast your business? Where do you want to be in 6 months? Where do you want to be in a year? And then what are the active steps that it will take for you right now to get to that place? So it's very much a mastermind. And that's all done with me. And that's every other week. There's a call. There's a 2-hour group call. where we dig into your business, and anything that you're experiencing is what we're going to start to work on. And you're going to hear the same from other women in your business. And this will happen in 6 calls over a 3-month period of time. And then after that 3-month period of time ends, we have an online group, and we often will meet up in person. And then every single month when you're in the collective, we have expert strategy calls. So there might be a call on building a newsletter. There might be a call on growing your business, on business growth or strategy. But every month there's continued education for the members. So it's a forever community. It's not just 3 months.
Love it. That's excellent. Now, what would you say gets you most excited about working with women entrepreneurs and helping them grow their businesses?
Yeah. So what's most exciting to me is really seeing in these women what is possible before they've yet had their aha moment, right? Like for so many of us, that's the perspective that we don't have for ourselves, is how big we can go, that I often will have with these women in the collective. On the very first call, they're asking questions that are fairly small, or they're asking asks that are fairly small. And by the 6th call, they realize how much they can possibly achieve, and their asks get bigger. Their businesses grow. And that, to me, there's nothing like that. There's nothing like watching that happen and watching someone really step into who they can be in this world.
That is so powerful, Cyndie. Just the idea. I've never thought of that before, even just thinking for myself, being selfish in the moment. Thinking for myself, though, just what kind of questions am I asking? And is it a big enough question? The question matters. What do they say? Empowered questions, right? The questions matter as much as the answer. And then just looking at that evolution of, am I asking small questions? And thinking bigger.
And women, I did this interview with Forbes, I think it was in January, and I remember speaking about asks in general and the kind of asks that women will ask. We don't like to offend people, right? So if you ask for what you want, some people get slightly offended. And an example I give in that article with Forbes was, I remember saying, when I have lunch with women, I don't like ice in my water. Now, I know this sounds crazy, Elayne, but I don't like ice in my water. And so I'll ask for water with no ice. I've had people look at me and say, did you really just send that back? I'm like, I'm paying for this. Of course I sent it back. I wasn't rude. I just don't want ice in my water.
And the simple thing, you're asking for what you want, and people think, how dare, right?
Right. So imagine, that's just ice in my water. Imagine about me asking for how much money I think I deserve. I mean, that would really set women over the edge. And that is the kind of work that we do in the collective, is like, you can no longer live a life where you don't feel comfortable asking for what you want, because you're almost more worried about offending the person next to you than you getting what you want or deserve in this life. You can't go on like that.
Right. You can't go on. You can't succeed like that. And do you think it's something that, and I'm sure you help women do this in the collective of us, is it also, it takes practice? Like some people think, I'm not good at asking, or I'm not good at negotiating, and so if you have to keep doing it and doing it.
Elayne, you are so right. And that's one of the things I say a lot when it comes to ask. I said, start with small asks. If you don't want ice in your water, start there.
Right.
If you want sugar or no sugar and you got it the wrong way, start there. You're paying for it, right? At the very least, ask for what you want if you're paying for it. Start with small asks. And this really, I think, comes from trusting your intuition, right? You know when something's not right. You know when you don't want something the way it's been given to you.
Right.
Why don't you send it back? Why don't you ask for it? Now, I don't mean be rude or pushy, but what I mean is that just ask for what you want. And don't tie anything else to it. Just, this is what I want, and so I'm going to ask. It's very simple. Start small.
So what would you say that you find many of the women entrepreneurs you work with need support with most? Is it about the ask, or do you see a pattern with something else, just to share with our listeners things that they can be aware of?
Yeah, I think partially it's about the ask, but also it's self-worth. How big can my business really be? How big do I deserve it to be? And so the ask to me often ties back, Elayne, to thinking small. And that sounds really cliche, but I think until you put it into action, it's very easy to fall into the pattern of thinking small. Of thinking, when it comes to your business, I can charge this much, but I certainly couldn't charge double that, until you charge double that and you realize that someone pays for it.
Right. I was going to ask you when you finished about that can tie into pricing as well for a lot of us.
That's a lot of the work.
Yeah.
Yep. And that, for me, that's one of the biggest, sort of wins, I think, with the collective community is I have there's a course that goes with it called Bold Business, and there's a module in that course about pricing. And you can talk about pricing all day long, but until you do the difficult work like I said, of charging double for something, for example, you will never get out of thinking small. I had, as an example, I had a woman in the collective who emailed me last week, and she had someone who was asking her to create, to do a commission for them. And she said, Cyndie, this is what I'm charging them. What do you think? I doubled the price. I sent it back to her, and I said, this is, I want you to think a lot bigger about this, and I want you to think about it from this perspective. She emailed me 3 days later and said they accepted. And do you know what that means? That means that from this point forward, she's going to start from that starting point.
Right. And she'll know that she's worth that and able to get that. That's right.
And unfortunately, Elayne, for so many of us, we need somebody else to approve. Like, I knew she was worth that long before they agreed to pay her that, but she didn't know that. And that's where we're seeking outside of ourselves. We're seeking somebody else's validation. So she needed somebody to say, yes, I'll pay that, in order for her to feel validated.
Do you think it's also important, too, for us to be okay with someone saying no, or no, I shouldn't say yes, or not tying that into our value as well? Yes. Like you said, saying yes helps, but then realizing if they say no, you're still worth that much. It just is not work for them.
That's right. And again, I keep saying this is a lot of the work we do, but it really is a lot of the work that ties into that, because you're so right. As much as it is about the yes, it's about the no, because if you can't, even had they not, obviously I gave an example where she did get the money that she asked for. Even if they said no, there's nothing about that means that her value is less. But that means we have to do the work for ourselves to understand our value and not have that be contingent on what 1 or 2 or 3 other people are willing to pay. Because then instead what that means is that you have to find the folks that will pay what you're asking for. Right? Maybe you don't know those people right now. That doesn't mean that you're worth any less. That could just mean that you're not in that world yet. Right? That's some of the work that you have to do.
That is powerful. That was worth the trip via Skype altogether. Maybe you don't know those people yet, and you have to continue to expand your circle, or people that you're even. I always tell people your friends aren't necessarily your customers.
Oh, they almost never are.
They almost never are. So even if your friends were willing to pay, they still might not be your customer. You have to look outside of that, and there's so many people in the world who would be willing to invest in you. As you said, you just have to find those people.
Yeah, and you may not know them right now, right? But it's the idea of this is the hard part of entrepreneurship, right? Tapping into what you don't yet know.
And how do we get through that? Just be okay with knowing that we don't know some things.
I wish I had a really concise answer for how we're okay with it, but I think part of it is just knowing that A, you're not alone in it, right? You're not alone in it. And B, knowing that, trusting, I suppose, rather than knowing that you will know what you need to know when you need to know it. We cannot know everything. We can't. And we don't need to. But when we need to know it, we will learn it.
That's right. What would you say that entrepreneurship has taught you about yourself as a woman?
Oh, my goodness. Entrepreneurship has hands down taught me how strong I was as a woman and how strong I am as a woman. Excuse me. I don't think I realized that I would ever have a garbage can moment, as it's so lovingly been known, right. And that I can come back from that, right? Because I don't have moments like that. I didn't think I ever would until I did, and I bounced back. And entrepreneurship not only taught me how strong I am as a woman, but also that failure is not an option. Meaning, just because something didn't go as planned, I didn't fail at anything, right? That was just part of the path to get to the next thing. Right. So part of that is being an entrepreneur taught me to fail fast and move on. And that comes about in every aspect of life, whether it's dating, it's friendships, it's business decisions, it's co-working spaces, fail fast and move on. Being an entrepreneur teaches you that, because you have no time. You will fail really quickly and miserably, and it will cost you a lot of money if you sit in it. So you learn to just keep moving. And that has been one of my biggest learnings from being an entrepreneur.
What would you say that your support network looks like?
A lot of women friends, and not just women. I think being in a space of, running something like the collective of us and being in a space of knowing a lot of women founders, it's equally important to have friends that aren't women founders, to have men that you can rely on, to have friends that are not in the industry. that you can rely on, friends who work for other people, because you need to have the balance of those conversations. You can't always talk about entrepreneurship all the time. And I'm sure you know this. It's so easy to fall into that trap because when you're an entrepreneur, you hopefully love what you do. And you can talk about it forever. But honestly, the normalcy comes from talking to folks about other things like, I don't know, their 2-year-old spit up, or, okay, maybe that's not interesting, but
it's interesting to them when they have 2-year-olds. So you listen.
Well, it's interesting to them, but also I think we have to get out of our own heads.
Right.
And listen to other people's realities, which are different than our own.
It's so funny for everyone listening. I'm talking to Cyndie while I'm here in Martha's Vineyard with friends and family, and they love me to death. I've known them for 20 plus something years since college. And, they know what I do. They support me. They're wonderful. But are they listening to the podcast every day? No. Most not. They're doing other things, but it's good because we can talk about other things. Or if they do say, oh, I love that episode that you did with so-and-so, I'm like, oh, you listened to it? What did you think? It's different because it's a different space. And some of them, they're great and successful in doing other things, but it's other things. It's not necessarily entrepreneurship or exact. So to your point, I totally hear you. You have to surround yourself with a variety of people who are doing different things and care about different things.
Yes. And it's I love what you just shared about the podcast, because I have one girlfriend who reads my newsletter all the time. And I'm pretty sure most of the rest of my really good friends that I grew up, they don't really know what I do for a living. And that's okay.
And they love you.
But they love me anyway, right?
Exactly.
But the time that you get that email that says, oh my gosh, I loved this newsletter, you think, oh, that means so much to me. Because you don't actually need to read this, but you are anyway, because you really believe in what I'm doing. So.
Right.
Yeah,
Excellent.
Just super powerful stuff to keep that balance in our friendships.
So in closing, Cyndie, if you think over your life and career and you had the chance to thank only one person whose support was critical to you personally or professionally, who would that be and what would you say?
Oh, see, you did not warn me that question was coming.
I didn't. I don't warn anyone.
You're the worst. I would thank my husband. Because when I was starting Cyndie Inc., I had just met him, and I truly, he's almost the opposite of who I am in a lot of ways. He's a lot more grounded. He's Midwestern. He's just a lot more grounded and normal. And I think it was that groundedness and normalcy that I needed to be able to fly as high as I have over the past few years. And if I didn't have that balance of him, I wouldn't be able to be where I am today. And I'm certain of that. It's sort of the yin and the yang of relationships. But I needed his groundedness to get me to where I am and to support me in being where I am. And so if I could say anything to him, that's what I'd say.
Beautiful. Thank you. So that was excellent for not knowing that was coming. Beautiful. So now tell us how we can support you. I'll have links to everything, of course, but tell everyone your website, social media, anything else you want us to know, and best ways to get in touch with you.
Awesome. So one of the easiest ways to connect with the work that I do is on Instagram at Cyndie Spiegel. I mini blog, and I've been using Instagram as a mini blog for years now. And I think that's how most folks find me, is on Instagram. So that's at Cyndie Spiegel. My website is cyndispiegel.com. And that's for my speaking and coaching work. And the Collective of Us, which is opening August 17th. We only open twice a year. So if you're interested in joining the Collective, we open August 17th and we will start in September. And that's just at thecollectiveofus.com.
Perfect timing. I'll make sure I have links to all of that. So for everyone listening, you'll be able to sign up if you listen right away. Excellent. Great. I will have links, and Cyndie is spelled Cyndie and Spiegel is Spiegel.
Yes, right? You got it. Yep.
Fantastic. Cyndie, thank you so much. This was so fun. You're incredible to talk to.
Elayne, you're a dream. Thank you. It was really, really lovely. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Martha's Vineyard. But let me know how I can help you as well.
Absolutely. Now, before
remember those asks.
Right. I know. I'm going to ask bigger too. Yeah, I got to get that together.
Do it.
Now, before you go, what's a parting piece of advice from you to our listeners about anything?
Women, we have the power to support one another in succeeding or in failing. So choose wisely. Your behavior towards another woman is something that's going to continue on. So be really mindful of how you treat one another.
Excellent. Cyndie Spiegel, hold on just a second. All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Cyndie. For more from her and how to get in touch with her and how to find out about the collective of us, go to supportissexypodcast.com and just search Cyndie, Cyndie, and her show notes page will pop up with all of the information, all of the resources. And I don't know if we mentioned in the episode, but Cyndie is also offering for a short time only a 10% discount for Support is Sexy members. So go to supportissexypodcast.com, search for Cyndie, and you can see information there where she's offering 10% off membership to the collective of us. They're doing another round from August 21st to August 27th, 2017. So if you're listening to this in real time between those dates, that's when she's doing the enrollment. You can save 10% off if you go there and find out the email, all of the information that you need. supportissexypodcast.com. Thank you so much, Cyndie. We appreciate it. We love discounts, gifts, all that great stuff. But the collective of us sounds like an amazing group. All right. So thank you all so much for listening. You know, I appreciate you. If you love the podcast, whether this is your first time listening or this is episode 200 plus for you, please leave a review, especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. It helps the show. It helps me, first of all, to hear feedback from you. I absolutely love it. I'm starting to read reviews every week and letting you all know some of the things that you said. The feedback has been great, both the criticism and the praise. I take it all, but I would love feedback and a review from you. Go there, quick, easy. Let me know what you think. I always say I'd love a 5-star review, but any feedback is important and valuable. So make sure you leave us a review. It helps the show. It helps more people to see it. It helps them continue to put it out there more and more. And that is what it's all about, right? Getting the message out to everyone that support is sexy, and having it all doesn't mean doing it all alone. All right. Thank you so much again for listening. And until next time, you know what to do. Go out there and create something sexy, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.